Hello and welcome back to this presentation. I will now examine some more key documents, particularly in relation to behaviour and supporting pupils' social and emotional development and mental health and well-being. We will also look at the Code of Practice in further detail. So before looking at the Code of Practice in more detail, I would like to just refer you to some further important documents you need to be aware of. They are detailed on the next couple of slides. You can read around them in your study time. I'll talk about a few of them just now. Firstly, we can see Behaviour and Discipline in Schools, January 2016. This document clearly outlines what schools need to do in terms of managing pupil behaviour and the types of discipline they can use. The language is particularly direct, referring to punishment, sanctions and reasonable force. However, embedded within the document is reference to Section 91 of the Education and Inspections Act 2006. The Act says, in terms of disciplining pupils, that the penalty must be reasonable in all the circumstances and that account must be taken of the pupil's age, any special educational needs or disability they have, or any religious requirements affecting them. This is a clear message that due regard must be given to individuals within the context of school behaviour and discipline policies. Moving on. Exclusion from maintained schools, academies and pupil referral units is another important document. It is made explicit in the exclusion guidance that excluding pupils must be lawful, reasonable and fair. Schools are reminded that they have a duty not to discriminate against pupils on the basis of the protected characteristics outlined in the Equality Act, including disability or race. So-called disruptive behaviour can be an indication of unmet needs, and the guidance is clear that where there are issues around particular pupils' behaviour, then further exploration about the causes and reasons should be carried out. In summary, then, it is important when implementing school behaviour and discipline policies that due regard is given to whether a pupil has special educational needs and or a disability. As a SENCO, you should have a role in working across school to ensure that the school behaviour and discipline policies for pupils we send is not exclusionary or discriminatory. You should work closely with staff to explore and understand the behaviour of individuals. Over recent years, there's been an increasing move towards considering pupils' behaviour within the context of their social and emotional well-being and seeing behaviour as a communication. This is now reflected in national documentation and guidance, including mental health and behaviour in schools. November 2018. This guidance highlights that schools have a central role in enabling pupils to be resilient and to support good mental health and well-being. It advocates for a consistent whole-school approach to mental health and well-being. Whilst it acknowledges that there needs to be a structured school environment with clear expectations around behaviour, this should be alongside graduated response when behavioural issues might be as a result of other needs and vulnerabilities. The guidance focuses on early intervention and strengthening resilience. It links to both Chapter 6 of the Code of Practice and to the Equality Act 2010. Another document is the Green Paper Transforming Children and Young People's Mental Health Provision. This document has now moved on to the more recent government response to the consultation Transforming Young People's Mental Health Provision. The original Green Paper had 3 core proposals, which were to incentivise and support all schools and colleges to identify and train a designated senior lead for mental health, to fund new mental health support teams supervised by the NHS Children and Young People's Mental Health staff, and to pilot a 4-week waiting time for access to specialist NHS Children and Young People's Mental Health services. The government response document sees these core proposals being actioned through various nationwide trailblazer projects. Your school could even be one of them. So thinking about pupils' social, emotional, mental health needs and well-being in your setting, particularly in light of issues related to COVID, what do you currently have in place and how do you support pupils? Do you have skilled staff to support this area of need, or what training do they require? Take a few moments to think about this. I've included some links to various documents. Firstly, the competency framework, which looks at the skills and competencies of staff within settings, essentially an audit process. Secondly, I've put in a link to East Sussex documentation relating to whole school support for children, young people and their mental health. I'm moving on now to look at the guidance associated with the Children and Families Act 2014, mainly the Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice, January 2015. This was a document we started looking at right at the beginning of the presentation, where we looked at Chapter 6 and the role of the SENCO. Just before we move on to looking at the code, I wanted to consider a moment whether a special educational need and disability are the same. The answer is no, they aren't, but they are closely linked and are often referred together within documentation. A young person or child with a special educational need does not necessarily have a disability. And neither does a young person with a disability necessarily have a special educational need, and we can consider this in a little more detail shortly. The Code of Practice is based on several principles. These are that there must be due regard given to the views, wishes and feelings of the child or young person and the child's parents. The participation of the child and young person and families is also seen as important. Note that it is emphasised that children and their families need to be provided with the information and support necessary to enable them to participate in decision making. That means enabling them to make informed decisions by providing them with information. Supporting children, young people and their families is also seen as important within the context of preparing them for adulthood. The principles are underpinned by an emphasis on inclusion and also person-centred approaches and planning. As SENCOs, you have a vital part to play in ensuring that your policies and practices within your settings and schools support both of these important agendas. You'll explore these in detail later. Think for a moment how inclusive your setting is and how it supports a person-centred planning approach. How do you involve pupils, parents, carers? How do you provide them with information? So there are some key definitions and terms within the Code of Practice. Spend a few moments just having a look and seeing if you can define those that I have listed here. On this slide, I have defined the terms for you, and the appropriate sections from the Code of Practice are detailed here. So basically, a young person, child, has special educational needs if they have got a learning difficulty or disability which calls for special educational provision to be made. A learning difficulty is defined by having a significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others of the same age. And special educational provision is educational provision or training provision that is additional to or different from that made generally for other children or young people of the same age. As I'm sure you are aware, the Code of Practice considers needs in 4 main areas, and these are detailed below. We have communication and interaction, cognition and learning, social, emotional and mental health difficulties or needs, and sensory and or physical needs. Provision in terms of provision, we've already indicated a pupil has a special educational need if their learning difficulty or disability means that they require provision which is different from or additional to that generally available. In these situations, the guidance indicates that schools and colleges must use their best endeavours to ensure such provision is made for those who need it. However, throughout the Code, there is a clear emphasis on high-quality teaching as the bedrock of support for pupils. Through high-quality teaching that is differentiated and personalised, the needs of most pupils will be met. This slide here just summarises the principles of high-quality teaching. So, what does this mean? It means that all teachers, and not just SENCOs, are responsible and accountable for the progress and development of pupils. As a SENCO, it means that you have an overall managing and coordinating role. Teachers will be responsible and accountable for the progress and development of the pupils in their class, and as SENCO, you will be ensuring that whole school policies and practice are in place to enable staff to do this. You will be providing guidance and training. It's likely that you will meet regularly with class teachers, subject staff to discuss pupil progress and review provisions. You will ensure that staff within your setting have the appropriate skills and resources to meet the needs of their pupils. Some children may have individual and group interventions to support their development and progress. However, you will be supporting teachers to link this back to what goes on in the classroom environment. This is essentially an inclusive approach. Identifying and planning for meeting the needs of children and young people is within the context of a graduated approach. This is essentially a 4-part cycle where previous actions are reviewed and revisited and where increasing levels of support are provided where necessary and appropriate, often referred to as the APDR cycle. It's important to comment on the funding for SEN within schools. Schools are provided with a notional amount of funding per pupil to support those with additional needs. This is not a ring-fenced amount but included in overall school budgets. SENCOs should be made aware of what funding is available in their schools in order that they are able to work strategically to plan provision resources and training. Schools aren't expected to meet the full costs of more expensive special educational provision. For pupils who require a high level of provision, this is often linked to an education, health and care plan. The Code of Practice states that a local authority must conduct an assessment of education, health and care needs when it considers it may be necessary for special educational provision to be made in accordance with an education, health and care plan. SENCOs are often the key person or mainly the key person in school in collaboration with parents who make requests for such additional funding and support. At this stage, local authorities usually require evidence of need and the provision of need and the provision that has already been put in place by schools to support pupils. As SENCO, you will need to have robust systems within school throughout the graduated approach so that when you need to demonstrate the support and needs and provision in place for a particular child, it can be done in a timely way. As we move on towards the conclusion of the presentation, I feel it's important just to say 1 or 2 words about the Special Educational Needs and Disability Tribunal process. Usually, parents and carers seek redress through a tribunal when there is concern about aspects of an education, health and care plan. This might often relates to the description of needs and the provision. Prior to the instigation of the tribunal process, attempts are usually made to resolve the process, the disagreements or disputes through mediation. Until a few years ago, the remit of the tribunal focused on just the educational element of the plan. However, it was extended a couple of years ago to include both health and social care aspects. This enables all aspects of an EHC to be raised through one channel. As SENCO, you may be requested to attend a tribunal or take part in the process and provide information about a young person, child's special educational needs and provision. A piece of documentation we've yet to mention is that related to supporting pupils with medical conditions. Many children with special educational needs and disabilities have medical conditions of varying complexity and often require specific plans to be in place to support them. This guidance states that pupils with medical conditions should be properly supported so they have full access to education, including school trips and physical education. It's important to consult with parents and young people and the children in relation to their medical needs and care needs when putting plans in place. Finally, as SENCO, it's useful and fairly important, in fact, to have knowledge about the local offer. The local offer is a way of giving children and young people and parents with special educational needs and disabilities information about what activities, services and support is available across education, health and social care, including the voluntary sector in the areas where they live. Are you aware of what is available in terms of your local offer? I would advise you to explore the local website and links so that you've got the information available for discussions with parents, carers, children and young people. That brings me to the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening.